Welcome back to the history and evolution of the MMORPG genre. This is Section 2 of Part 1, Beginnings and Evolution. About a month ago from the time this video is released, I reviewed the original Everquest. Now I want to look at how the genre had evolved to its sequel, Everquest 2. My initial reaction is that Everquest 2 is way closer to what I am used to than Meridian 59 and Everquest were. Released in 2004, this was 5 years after the launch of Everquest and 8 years after Meridian 59. In that time, the MMO genre had flourished into its own niche in games. It wasn't a mainstream genre yet, but it had some classics already out like Anarchy Online, Final Fantasy XI, and EVE Online. In my opinion, Everquest 2 would be the closest to what mainstream MMORPGs would look like in the coming years. Now let's plug Everquest 2 into the KedBQ system. This is a system that I came up with that analyzes MMORPGs to see if they have certain traits that every MMORPG should have. First, we'll start with the character. Players can choose from a wide variety of races, now with 6 good races, 6 evil races, and 9 neutral races. The player would also choose a class for their character, which basically is how they would fight. These were split up into 4 groups, with one class being a good race class and an evil race class. These groups were the fighters with 9 classes, the mages also with 9 classes, and the priest with 11 classes. Finally, they had the scouts with 11 classes. As for how the game would immerse players, at least in the very beginning, the player is nothing special, just another cog in the wheel of whatever king or queen they serve. You would be given gopher quests and basically be told to kill or collect certain things to give to higher ranking NPCs. Eventually, the player would acquire enough power that they would be given missions to save the realm. But you had to start from somewhere. On to economy. This is the biggest change from Meridian 59 that I can see. Now, players could sell things to the broker, and that would be available to other players to purchase. This also was aided in the harvesting mechanic, allowing players to gather raw materials from their surrounding to sell to other players who would use those items to craft gear, weapons, food, potions, and etc. It gave players a way to make money in-game to purchase better items, and most importantly, it gave players different viable ways to play and interact with each other. For the dungeons section, Everquest is true to its name. There are tons of quests available to play that all have the players interacting with the world and doing tasks that have an impact on the world around them, at least to some degree. The actual dungeons in the game are areas where players must interact with other players to complete a quest in that area. Predominantly, you would have a tank, 2 DPS, and a healer in these. That is to say that players don't have to complete every quest. More often than not, before they actually leave an area, they will have a higher level than anything in the area. So this would make it to where the experience they are getting was minimal. The game has players moving from area to area to keep up with their level. And with lots of quests to go back and do, there was never a shortage of PvE content. Just like the dungeons section, the bosses section sees Everquest having tons of unique and named monsters throughout its long run, all of which offered a challenge needing to be tackled by multiple players. Outside at least of the field bosses, of which you can see one on screen now. These bosses could be tackled by one player if the player was high enough. They would usually leave special loot that players could collect. In later games, bosses like this would actually have unique spells or attack patterns that players would have to learn, but they hadn't gotten there yet. Fighting was still usually just standing in one area and shooting whatever spells or abilities you have as long as you're in the correct range. Now onto the competition section. Players of different factions were free to attack each other whenever they countered each other in-game. That was why there was a distinction between good, bad, and neutral characters. The combat had been refined to where combat abilities would differ between PvE or PvP combat to make things more fair between players. An example of this would be a stunning ability that, for regular enemies, would have them stuck in place. For players, however, if they were hit with the same stun, they would be slowed, still able to move and cast abilities, but at a disadvantage. Also, while I said there was good, bad, and neutral characters, this doesn't mean that there was 3 factions. The neutral characters usually just got to choose which side they were on, whether it be the good or the bad side of the game. In the endgame section, we see that Everquest 2 has a raid system for the endgame players. These raids had to be tackled by large numbers of players and had the hardest bosses, most dangerous enemies, and the best loot and materials. Ideally, these would be attempted by players with guilds, which were the groups of players that had played with each other regularly. Because the raids were easier with coordination and communication, guilds fared better in this environment rather than random groups, although the content was possible either way. Now we can talk about the world section. The world of Everquest 2 was a mix of persistent and instance areas. The overworld were different areas that were large and persistent, meaning that any player within that area would run into other players playing the game as well. While raids, dungeons, and certain in-game events were held in instance sections, meaning that players had to move into a different instance server that ran these areas. And this was because the instance areas were usually more scripted, and it was usually easier on the servers to run this way. Now I'd like to talk about the UI, which stands for user interface, and how the game feels. First of all, like Meridian 59, we do have a mini-map on the right side of the screen. And now, unlike Meridian 59, this one is far more involved, with icons over different vendors or landmarks. And if you hover your mouse over them, it'll actually tell you what those are. However, if you press a key on your keyboard, you can bring up your entire map, and it'll let you drag it around. And first of all, it is way better than Meridian 59. It is leagues better than Everquest 1 was. If you go back and watch my Everquest 1 video, that map was just lines that barely defined anything. On this map, you can see like landmarks, like how this palace, the Dark Light Palace here, has walls and the general shape of the building, and that it's surrounded by water, and the map actually has color and things like it. It's much more useful for navigating. And I believe that yes, you can actually still have your map up and be moving around, so you can see your red arrow here moving up and down on the screen and back and forth and tell you where you're looking. Next thing I would like to talk about is how the game has its skills displayed. In the bottom half of the screen here, you see all these little different pictures. The class I'm playing uses pets like Zabraner here, and most of my skills are actually just commands to give to my pet. This can either be clicked with your mouse, like this, causing the player to go into or the avatar to go into their animation and use the skill, or you can even, for at least this bar, you can use your number keys, and the other action bars, as they're called in this game, require you to press like control plus whatever the number is. Personally, I actually have an easier time just clicking, and I'm able to do that because the class that I'm playing as, the Necromancer, doesn't actually have to move much in combat. Speaking of movement, Everquest 2 uses the standard movement scheme that most MMOs use, which is with your mouse, your left click allows you to move the camera freely without moving your player. Your right click allows you to move the camera like you would with your left click, but that also moves how your character is looking. So if you're holding down and pressing your movement buttons, you can move around freely. Speaking of your movement buttons, the WASD keys are your predominant keys most MMORPGs will use for movement. Obviously, W is forward, A makes you rotate to your left, D to your right, and S backwards. You can also use your Q and E keys to strafe. I find that just using my right click, holding that down and moving around is the best way that works for me. There is another way where if you hold down both of your mouse buttons, it causes your character to start moving forward on their own, and then you can move your mouse around to change your direction. I don't use that much unless my other hand is tied up in casting spells and I need to move real quick. The Necromancer class is a mage class, and predominantly in MMORPGs you'll have the big three for combat, where you'll have a tank that attracts attention and takes most of the damage of the fight, the DPS that stand for damage per second, and they deal most of the damage of the fight while the tank is keeping the enemy's attention, and then you have your healer, which obviously by the name heals the party. This is the bag page. I can get to that by either pressing a bag down here or pressing a key on my keyboard. In this game, it actually has you collecting a regular bag here, but then you can get smaller bags to expand your inventory. And this is a function that a lot of games would end up using. The last thing about the UI that I wanted to talk about is how it looks when you talk to a NPC. And here you see it brings up these speech bubbles. And in EverQuest 1, it would have everything down here in the chat section, which was not great. Because the chat was always moving, you were having to scroll back and find whoever you're talking to. Now, these bubbles just come up here, although it does say still down in your chat what you're saying, or what your NPC you're talking to is saying. If you were to be getting a quest from them over here on the left side, it would pop up saying for you to accept it. Basically, it made it to where it was a lot easier to tell what you were saying to NPCs. Now, keep in mind that the amount of content in EverQuest 2 has ballooned with time and the 17 expansions it's gone through. But even looking at the original game, it has more content and technology than its ancestor. However, I think that it's a bloated version of the genre up to that point. There's just so much world building that the player could learn about between the history of all the races and the reason that some races are evil and others are good. It's a daunting amount of information that the game had to expand on even on release, which is a possible reason why the genre was still a small portion of the video game world in 2004. Their game is so deep at first glance with just the character creation that it could be intimidating for a new player. In the next video, we're going to look at World of Warcraft that came out 15 days after EverQuest 2. You'll see a lot of similarities. Both have a deep lore with players choosing which side they want to be on starting at the character creation. A difference, and possible reason for the difference in their popularity, was that WoW was more focused initially than EverQuest 2 was. EverQuest had to introduce players to so much at the beginning, and with so many different possible sides and races, it was a lot more complicated at the start of the game for players. In summary, from the foundations that Meridian 59 established to EverQuest 2, I think it's safe to say that a lot had changed. Obviously, the games look prettier because of technology improving, but game developers had discovered the unique opportunities to tell stories and create worlds that these games provided. The genre had unlimited potential for what it could become. That being said, I still would absolutely recommend giving these games a shot. Both are still operating, and both are free. There's a charm in the simplistic and straightforward gameplay of Meridian 59, And there's so much to do in EverQuest 2 nowadays that any fan of an MMO can appreciate it. Thank you for watching this video. This is the end of part 1 of a 4-part series. The next video will be focusing on World of Warcraft, so I hope you will tune in to watch that as well. Again, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you later. Bye.